In a quiet southern town, there was a house shaded by towering willows, a house where secrets festered in the dark and the living weren't the only ones watching. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we explore the most chilling true horror stories that blur the lines between the living and the dead. Tonight, we unravel the haunting truth behind my family's mysterious rule, why we were forbidden to wave at the neighbors across the street. As we unravel this chilling story, don't forget to subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. We bring you the most haunting true horror stories, where the line between reality and fear disappears. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story that keeps you up at night. The house was small and unassuming, a modest white home with a slanted roof, sitting beneath the heavy canopy of two enormous willow trees. Those trees had a presence, almost like sentinels, their long, draping branches swaying even when the air was still. They framed the house in a way that was both beautiful and oppressive, casting it in a perpetual shadow, even on the brightest days. The sunlight seemed to avoid that place, as though it didn't belong there. At first, it was simply a curiosity, the way the house seemed cloaked in its own private dusk. But in time, it began to feel more like a warning. We were no strangers to moving. My stepfather's job had us packing boxes and hauling furniture from one town to the next so often. It felt like no place ever truly belonged to us. For me, as the youngest of three siblings, this constant uprooting was all I'd ever known. My two older sisters and I found ways to make the best of it, though. Each new town was an adventure, and each new house became a playground for our imaginations. This house was no different, at least not at first. Our family wasn't perfect, but we were close. My stepfather worked long hours at the Pepsi plant, leaving my mother to handle the chaos of raising three active kids. She was loving but strict, the kind of mother who always made sure the rules were clear and that we followed them without question. My sisters and I spent most of our time outside, climbing trees, riding bikes, and playing every game we could think of. The yard beneath those willow trees became our world, filled with laughter and the kind of joy that only children can conjure. Across the street from our house was a small, well-kept home with a neatly painted porch. Sitting there almost every evening was an elderly couple. They always seemed to be there, as reliable as the setting sun. The man, tall and thin with a kind smile, would rock gently in his chair while his wife, her silver hair pinned neatly back, sipped from a glass of lemonade. They waved at everyone who passed by, and their smiles felt like a warm embrace. To us, they were the epitome of what neighbors should be: friendly, welcoming, and always present. My mother would often wave back, her face lighting up with the same cheerfulness they seemed to radiate. For those first few months, life in the house felt simple and good. My sisters and I would swing from the willow branches, laughing until our sides hurt. We set up a slip and slide on the lawn, its bright colors a stark contrast to the grayish-green shade of the yard. On weekends, we filled a small inflatable pool with water and splashed around while my stepfather grilled burgers on the back porch. The neighbors watched us from their porch, their rocking chairs creaking gently in rhythm with the summer breeze. There was comfort in their presence, as though they were quietly looking out for us. But then everything changed. It was a late summer evening when my mother called us inside, her voice sharper than usual. The sky outside was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the air was thick with the sound of cicadas. We gathered in the living room, still damp from playing in the inflatable pool, our laughter fading as we noticed the serious expression on her face. She sat us down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and told us something that made no sense at the time. "From now on," she said, her voice steady but unnaturally firm, "you are not to wave at the neighbors across the street. In fact, I don't want you looking at them at all. If they wave at you, come inside immediately and tell me." The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating the playful mood that had filled the house moments before. My sisters and I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Why?" one of my sisters asked, her voice tinged with confusion. But my mother didn't answer. She simply repeated the rule, her tone leaving no room for argument, and told us to promise we would obey. For kids who had been taught to respect their elders and embrace kindness, the rule felt wrong, unnatural. The couple across the street had always been so sweet, so friendly. Why would we suddenly treat them like strangers, like something to be avoided? My sisters and I didn't understand it, but we followed the rule. What choice did we have? We stopped waving. We stopped looking. And slowly, the couple became little more than a shadowy presence in the periphery of our lives. At the time, I thought it was just one of those mysterious adult decisions, the kind you never question because you assume there must be a good reason behind it. But looking back, I realize how much my mother's tone betrayed her fear. She wasn't just being cautious. She was protecting us from something she didn't want to explain. Those first few months in that house had been filled with laughter and light. But after that day, it was as though a cloud had settled over us. The willow trees seemed to stretch their branches further, their shadows growing darker and more oppressive. The once joyful yard became a place of unease, and the house across the street, a place of warmth and welcome, became something we avoided at all costs. What I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that my mother's rule was rooted in something far more chilling than we could have imagined. The truth would come out years later, and when it did, it changed everything I thought I knew about that house, about our neighbors, and about the shadows that lingered beneath those willow trees. For a while, my sisters and I didn't understand. The rule seemed so strange, so out of place. Why couldn't we wave at the neighbors? What could they have possibly done to warrant such a sudden and strict decree from our mother? For as long as we had lived there, they had been nothing but kind, a comforting presence in our transient lives. And yet, just like that, they were off limits. At first, we tried to push back, asking questions that my mother refused to answer. Why can't we wave at them? Did they do something wrong? She would only respond with, "You don't need to know. Just listen to me." Her tone left no room for argument, but her refusal to explain only made the whole situation more unsettling. What could she know that we didn't? The days that followed felt different. The joy and innocence that had defined our time in the yard seemed to fade. Even as kids, we could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't the house or the willow trees. It was something else, something harder to name. It was as if an invisible weight had settled over the neighborhood. We stopped playing near the edge of the yard, where we could see their porch. My sisters and I would glance at each other nervously whenever we caught sight of the couple. They were still there, sitting in their rocking chairs, smiling and waving like always. But now their gestures didn't feel warm. They felt wrong, forced, like they were performing some kind of ritual, and we were their only audience. And then the incidents began. It started small. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, I would hear faint noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the willow branches. But the sounds didn't match the rhythm of the breeze. It was softer, more deliberate, like footsteps, slow and careful, circling the house. One evening, as I sat on the porch alone, I felt it for the first time. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. It wasn't like the casual glances of a passerby. It was sharper, heavier, as if someone's eyes were boring into the back of my head. I turned quickly, expecting to see my sisters sneaking up on me, but there was no one there. Only the yard, the trees, and the house across the street, their porch bathed in shadow. As the weeks went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My sisters stopped playing outside as much, claiming they felt uncomfortable, though they couldn't say why. My mother, who had always been strict but composed, seemed more on edge than usual. Even the house itself felt different. The creaks in the floorboards seemed louder, the shadows in the corners darker. And then there was the couple. They never stopped waving. Every time we stepped outside, there they were, sitting in their chairs, rocking gently, their smiles as fixed as ever. But the smiles weren't comforting anymore. They felt hollow, as if their faces were masks hiding something beneath. It was the stillness that unnerved me most. They never spoke, never moved beyond that slow rhythmic rocking. Sometimes, it almost seemed like they weren't real, like they were part of the house itself, rooted to the porch just as the willows were rooted to the ground. One evening, I couldn't help myself. I broke the rule. I waved. It wasn't much, just a quick flick of my hand, barely a gesture at all. But the moment I did, I regretted it. The woman's head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging me, and for the first time, her smile faltered. Her face didn't change much, just a subtle shift in the corners of her mouth. But it was enough. Enough to make my heart race and my stomach twist. I ran inside, my mother's warning echoing in my head. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the house with a purpose. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to move. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, felt like it was closing in on me. By then it wasn't just a rule anymore. It was survival. The couple across the street, the neighbors we had once trusted, once waved at without a second thought, they weren't safe. They weren't neighbors. They were something else. And whatever they were, I knew one thing for sure. They were watching. Years passed, and the house under the willow trees became just another chapter in the long list of places we'd called home. Life moved on as it always does, and the memories of that time, though strange, began to fade. That is, until one evening, when we found ourselves sitting together for a rare family dinner. It was one of those moments that felt both nostalgic and bittersweet, a small reminder of how fleeting time can be. My sisters and I laughed as we recounted stories from our childhood, from the silly games we played to the strange quirks of the many homes we had lived in. Eventually, as conversations often do, we circled back to that house. The laughter quieted as someone mentioned the neighbors across the street. My mother's expression changed immediately. Her smile faded, and her eyes dropped to her plate. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I didn't want to tell you back then," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were too young, and I didn't want to scare you." Her reluctance only made the moment more chilling. My sisters and I leaned in, waiting for her to continue. What she told us next made the blood drain from my face. She explained that during the time we lived in that house, my stepfather had struck up a casual friendship with a coworker at the Pepsi plant. One day, in a passing conversation, he mentioned the elderly couple who lived across the street, their kind smiles, their ever-present rocking chairs. The coworker's reaction was not what he expected. The man stared at him, confused, almost incredulous. "What are you talking about?" he asked. My stepfather, equally confused, described the couple again, But the coworker shook his head. "There's no one living in that house," he said firmly. "There hasn't been for years." The coworker went on to tell him a story, one that would make anyone question everything they thought they knew. 3 years before we moved in, the house across the street had been home to an elderly couple. They were quiet, reclusive, and kept to themselves for the most part. But one day, the neighbors noticed that they hadn't seen the couple in several days. Concerned, the coworker, who lived nearby at the time, decided to check on them. What he found inside was horrifying. The couple had died of carbon monoxide poisoning. Their stove had been leaking gas for days, silently filling the house with the toxic fumes. They must have fallen asleep, never realizing what was happening. By the time they were discovered, their bodies had already begun to decay. The sight, the smell, it was something the coworker said he would never forget. But what haunted him most was the stillness of the house after that. No one had moved in since their deaths. The house remained empty, abandoned, its windows dark and its porch silent. When my stepfather told my mother this story, she was horrified. The couple we had waved at every day, the ones who smiled so kindly and seemed so real, they couldn't have been alive. They couldn't have been there at all. As my mother recounted this, I felt the air in the room grow heavier, colder. My sisters sat frozen, their faces pale, as the truth settled over us like a suffocating fog. We had spent months smiling and waving at something that wasn't there, something that shouldn't have been there. I thought back to those days under the willow trees, the shadows stretching long across the yard, the couple's unwavering presence on their porch. The way they always seemed to be watching, always smiling. My stomach churned as I realized the betrayal of it all. Those smiles, so warm and inviting, were not the smiles of kind neighbors. They were the smiles of something else entirely. Even now, I can't make sense of it. Were they trying to communicate with us? Did they mean us harm? Or were they simply lost, trapped in some echo of their former lives? I don't know. What I do know is that the memories of that time will never feel the same. The laughter, the games, the innocent waves, all of it is stained by the knowledge of what we didn't see, of what we didn't understand. And sometimes, when I think about it too long, I wonder, did they ever stop watching? The decision to leave that house wasn't made overnight, but it became inevitable. My mother's revelation lingered like a shadow over our family, making it impossible to see our home the same way again. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the willow branches seemed amplified, filled with a sinister weight we couldn't ignore. What was once a place of play and laughter had turned into something oppressive, something that felt alive in the worst possible way. My stepfather, ever the practical one, insisted we keep moving forward. He brushed off my mother's concerns as imagination, though his own unease was hard to hide. My sisters and I didn't say much, but we all avoided the yard as if it were cursed. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap. Within weeks, we packed our things and moved on, as we had so many times before. But this time was different. This time, the house stayed with us. The memories clung to us like smoke. My sisters and I spoke about it rarely, as if saying the words out loud might summon the couple back. But even in our silence, the fear remained. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would hear them, the faint sound of rocking chairs creaking in the wind, though we were miles away from that house. And then there were the dreams. I would wake in a cold sweat, the image of the elderly couple's faces burned into my mind. In the dreams, they were always smiling, always waving, but their smiles weren't kind anymore. They were hollow, stretched too wide, their eyes dark and empty. It wasn't just us either. A few years later, I overheard my mother on the phone talking to someone from that old neighborhood. Her voice was hushed, tense, as if she didn't want anyone to hear. When she hung up, I asked her what the call was about. She hesitated, then told me about the stories that had been spreading among the neighbors. Some of them had seen lights flickering in the windows of the abandoned house, even though no one had lived there since we moved out. Others swore they heard voices, soft, indistinct whispers carried on the wind. One neighbor claimed to have seen two figures sitting on the porch in the dead of night, rocking silently in their chairs. When they went to check, the chairs were empty, and the porch was still. These stories should have been comforting in a way, proof that it wasn't just us who had experienced something strange. But instead, they only deepened the mystery. What were they? Spirits trapped in a place they couldn't leave? Or something darker, something that used their image to gain our trust? Even now, I don't have answers. I only have questions and the uneasy feeling that we left something behind in that house, something that still watches from the shadows beneath the willow trees. I sometimes wonder if the spirits meant us harm or if they were simply lost, searching for the life they once had. But then I think about the way their smiles changed, the way the air grew heavy when they were near, and I wonder, were they ever just watching, or were they waiting? Looking back, it's impossible to shake the feeling that our time in that house was about more than just the neighbors. It felt as if we had stepped into a space where the past and present collided, a place where time had unraveled in strange and unsettling ways. Were we being haunted by echoes of a tragedy that refused to let go? Or was it something more deliberate, more aware? The couple we thought we knew, those kind smiles and gentle waves, represented safety, warmth, and the kind of neighborly charm you'd expect in a small southern town. But what we didn't realize was how easily appearances can deceive. Whether they were spirits trapped by the tragic circumstances of their deaths, or something far darker using their forms to gain our trust, one thing is clear: we were not alone in that house. There's something profoundly unsettling about betrayal on such a fundamental level. We trusted those smiles. We believed in the simplicity of their kindness. And yet, beneath that facade lay something unknowable. It's not just the betrayal of perception. It's the betrayal of reality itself. When you can no longer trust what you see, when even a friendly wave can carry sinister undertones, it shakes the very foundation of what you believe to be true. Our story isn't unique. Across history, there are countless accounts of hauntings tied to tragic deaths, where the energy of a life cut short seems to linger, replaying moments or attaching itself to the living. One famous case comes to mind: the Bell Witch haunting in Tennessee, where a family claimed to be tormented by a spirit connected to unresolved conflict and death. Like our story, it began with small, seemingly harmless encounters, but grew into something far more terrifying. And then there's the Smurl family haunting in Pennsylvania, where a series of strange events in their home was later linked to the death of a previous occupant. In both cases, the stories share a common thread, a sense of betrayal, of being deceived by something you cannot fully understand. The question remains: were the neighbors we saw across the street simply echoes of the life they once lived, trapped in an endless loop, or were they something else entirely? Were they aware of us, or were we just accidental witnesses to their existence? And most chillingly, did they mean us harm? The human mind craves explanations. It seeks patterns, answers, and closure. But sometimes, the truth isn't something we're meant to understand. Sometimes, it's enough to walk away, to leave the shadows where they belong. What I do know is this: that house beneath the willow trees remains as it was when we left it, quiet, still, and forever watching. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a yard, staring at a porch where shadows linger and rocking chairs sway without cause, ask yourself, is it the past you're seeing or something much worse? What do you think about the haunting truth behind this story? Were the neighbors across the street lost spirits trapped by their tragic deaths? Or was there something darker at play? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your theories. And while you're here, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Eerie Road Tales, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another unsettling tale that will keep you up at night. Remember, sometimes the sweetest smiles hide the darkest secrets. Stay safe out there, and keep your shades drawn